Good morning. Well, as we all know, the general election campaign has been pushed off course by the hideous Manchester murders. In other weeks, we might have been talking about Brexit, taxes and the health service, all still very important, but there is no getting away from it. One question now is at the centre of this debate. Who do we most trust to keep Britain safe? And after Election Day, one of these two women will be in charge of police and security on the streets of Britain. Should our next Home Secretary be the Conservative Amber Rudd or Labour's Diane Abbott? Plus two party leaders with their take on terror. Caroline Lucas from the Green Party and on the line from Cardiff, Plaid Cymru's Leanne Wood. And reviewing the news for us today, the BBC's North America editor, John Sopel, just back from Trump on tour, and two people who've been inside government at times of crisis, the former Labour Home Secretary Jackie Smith and David Cameron's former Communications Director Sir Craig Oliver. And we've been thinking about Manchester all week, here to play us out this morning with a fresh take on a Hacienda Club classic, the vocalist, Rowetta and musicians from the Manchester Camerata.
Sometimes I feel like throwing my hands up in the air. I know I can count on you. Sometimes I feel like saying, Lord, I just don't care. You got the love I need to see me through.
All that coming after the news read for us this morning by Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. Police investigating the terror attack in Manchester have released new images of Salman Abedi, the man who carried out the bombing. These CCTV pictures were taken in the hours before the attack on Monday. Police are asking anyone who may have seen him to contact them. Officers have arrested 11 people during searches of addresses across the northwest of England. Well, both the Conservatives and Labour are promising to improve security if they win the general election. The Tories say that they will set up a commission with statutory powers to advise the government on defeating extremism. Labour is pledging to recruit an extra 1,000 staff to the security and intelligence services. The Scottish National Party will today outline a plan to free up to £118 billion in extra public spending over the next 5 years. The SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, says the proposals would help the economy to grow and safeguard public services. The party will release its plans in detail when it publishes its manifesto on Tuesday. Disruption is continuing at Heathrow Airport after a widespread IT failure yesterday caused British Airways planes to be grounded. Thousands of passengers were stranded at Heathrow and Gatwick after all BA flights were cancelled. BA has apologised for the disruption and advises passengers travelling today to check the status of their flights. Sport finally, and Arsenal are celebrating after winning the FA Cup for a record 13th time. The 2-1 victory over Chelsea at Wembley ended a frustrating season for the Gunners. Arsenal's board is to meet on Tuesday to decide the future of manager Arsene Wenger. That's all from me. The next news here on BBC One is at 12:15. Andrew, back to you.
Many thanks. And now, as ever, to the papers. One image dominates, as you've seen from the news, Abedi, the bomber, just moments before he set the bomb off. There's the Observer with a story saying that we need the EU to help us combat terror. Terrorism experts have told the Prime Minister. There's the Sun, minutes from mass murder, the same picture. And again, the Sunday Mirror, moments before massacre. The Sunday Telegraph has a very small version of the picture there, and the royal presence at the Manchester commemorations. Their story is about a minister attacking the social media for being duplicitous in failing to halt terror attacks. We're going to hear a lot more about that, I suspect, in the programme to come. And there finally is the Sunday Times. Nervous Tories to relaunch May's campaign, they say. Of all the opinion polls out today, it's the Sunday Times one that shows the gap closest. And they're making a lot of that. Then again, the picture of Abedi and many other stories. So an awful lot to talk about. Craig Oliver, I guess it's a morning of contrast in terms of the newspapers when it comes to the terror attack.
Yeah, and I think that contrast is summed up by these two photographs here, one of which is Salman Abedi, a sociopath, just minutes before committing mass murder. And trying to work out what on earth was going through his head at that time. He looks incredibly calm, and it's an extraordinary image. But actually, the reality, I think, the most interesting thing is to look at some of the more human aspects of this, and I think the papers do this very well. The Sunday Mirror has got an article about Charlotte Brownhill, who was a nurse in A&E, and she talks about scans showed nuts and bolts inside bodies. It's something I'll never forget, and I thought the most touching thing was at the end when she says, "When I got home, I cried because the reality was only just sinking in. My only way of coping is to think of the goodness we saw that night and in the days since." And I think in all the politicking around the security, remembering these people and the price they paid is still really important.
It's also interesting to remember that, of course, it's become slightly fashionable to sort of have a go at NHS managers, but that happens, that sort of care, because of the dedication of NHS staff and because, frankly, it is prepared for, and there are trials and tests and practices, and that's why the NHS was, and other emergency services were able to step up in the way in which they did on Monday night, really impressively.
And, of course, when you were Home Secretary, one of the things you would be doing when it comes to these kind of events is trying to track where the bombers have come from. And you have got a story, I think, in the Sunday Telegraph.
There's some really interesting analysis, actually, in the papers today about the international links to the current terror threat and of actually the sort of history of Abedi and his family and their links to Libya and the Libyan Islamic fighting group, etc. This is a challenge for terrorism because this threat changes over time. 10 years ago, we were talking about Afghanistan, Pakistan, the border, the threat from Al-Qaeda. Actually, there was a lot of focus on the threat from jihadists travelling backwards and forwards to Syria. And here we see a threat that actually appears to have been at least prompted by links to Libya.
And, of course, it has to be said that Libya collapsed as a state on David Cameron's watch. It was our intervention there that knocked out the Gaddafi regime and unfortunately left a failed state, which Abedi has...
Well, you see the reality of the complication of this, and when you look at the Middle East, the tendency is to want to look and see that there's goodies and baddies, and the reality is it's a very, very complex situation and an extremely difficult one, and you're right, this week has shown that.
John Soper, let's turn to you. A lot of social media coverage of this, of course, as well.
Yes, of course, and I think that this is one of the areas where you feel that the technology of social media is so far ahead of any policy that knows quite how to deal with it. And so you've got the security minister, as you were saying in the introduction, Ben Wallace, talking about the duplicity, completely duplicitous social media companies for flogging users' personal information to questionable companies but refusing to help terror investigations. And you're seeing it all over the world where you've got law enforcement agencies who would love to get hold of some of the data that these companies have got. You're selling a product if you are one of the big technology companies and you want to encrypt it so that your customers' material can't be stolen, and that is a major bar to investigation.
But this is all about who in the modern world is most powerful. Are they the people running WhatsApp or national governments? And it's no longer clear who's really got the whip hand.
It's very far from clear. But, you know, and people obviously, understandably, in normal times, talk about their privacy and the right to privacy and guarding their own data. And when you get something like this, and it happened after the San Bernardino attack in California, where they found a phone, but they couldn't break into it, that people suddenly say, it's a matter of national security that we can.
I think at this point we haven't even mentioned the words general election, but we are in the middle of a general election campaign. Theresa May's got an interview in The Sun, I think, and not surprisingly, which she's taken. Sorry, we haven't got it there.
She's written, she's written an article in The Sun which is understandably about the security issues today. But I think that if you read most of the newspapers today, what you see is coverage of how is the campaign going for each party. And there's a huge amount of stuff in here about the wobble in the Conservative Party over the last week. And Tim Shipman's done a piece in the Sunday Times where he quotes an MP saying, "It's a major cock-up. Corbyn can't win this, but we could lose it. And we've been given a bloody good go at that. All the manifesto offered was blood, sweat and tears."
There is a real feeling that just before the Manchester massacre, there was a big wobble, the U-turn over social care, and a real sense that the campaign was not going as planned.
And if you run your campaign on the basis of your leader being strong and stable, and you are arguing that actually we need to re-elect this person to handle the very difficult Brexit negotiations, and then you have a monster mess-up, essentially, in your manifesto and your plans, that is going to cause, rightly, is going to cause a wobble, and people are going to wonder about what it is they're being asked to vote for.
And the message from the Conservatives now is we want to focus again on leadership, and if there's one word that we want to keep repeating, it's Corbyn, Corbyn. And you pick that up from the Mail interview with Amber Rudd, who's coming on the programme.
Yes, and Simon Walters, their excellent political editor, has done an interview with her in which he says, you know, are you suggesting it would mean a greater risk of another terrorist atrocity if Corbyn became Prime Minister? Ms Rudd stressed she was not linking it to the Manchester bomb, but added, it absolutely does. Yes, and I think that you're seeing and Theresa May at her news conference that I went to at the G7 Friday evening, she also was trying to make absolutely clear the link between, you know, national security, safe with me, at risk if you elect Jeremy Corbyn as well.
And of course, Jeremy Corbyn does have some problems in his record, looking back, to say the least, his connections with the IRA and all the rest of it in the past. But it's very, very difficult in the middle of an election campaign to accuse somebody else of supporting terrorism after something like Manchester. This question of good taste and what's appropriate and reasonable to say is very, very hard for politicians to get right.
Which is why I agree with you that, you know, the terror attack was terrible. The juxtaposition with the general election campaign, which almost seems sort of naff to talk about, but actually it is casting a shadow. And in one way, you need the general election campaign actually to get back on track, because it's that democratic process, which of course the terror attack was partly against. But it's also difficult to judge rightly. And this seems to me to be a misjudgment to start talking about how many people are going to get killed under different
I mean, I think to be fair to the Home Secretary, what's actually happened here, she's been asked the question and she's made the mistake in politics of actually answering it. And actually what we need to do is get this onto who's best to look after security. But having said all this stuff about the wobbles and the difficulty of the Conservative campaign this week, I think that The Sun actually gives a good dash of cold water to the face and just reminds people of what's really happening here. And if you look at this graphic in The Sun, Tories 46%, Labour 32%, on the issue of the economy, May 43%, Corbyn 24%, on security, May 41%, Corbyn 17%. So let's not get carried away here.
2 weeks ago, Craig.
Yeah, well, political historians, I think, would say in most election campaigns what happens is ups, there's downs, there's spills, there's thrills, and at the end of them you get more or less the result that you expected right at the beginning.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that's the lesson of most campaigns. But there is other bits of collateral damage that can happen during the campaign as well. And I was kind of struck by an Observer kind of research that says that favourability ratings for Theresa May, suggesting that more than a third of voters say their opinion of the Prime Minister is more negative than at the start of the campaign. 25% say it's more positive. And for Jeremy Corbyn, the reverse. And actually, as the campaign has gone on, he seems to have grown in popularity.
He's a real campaigner. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Craig Oliver, everybody is losing it a bit. They're exhausted, they're tired, they're snapping. It happens in every election campaign. You've both been involved in the atmosphere inside. We now see that the Prime Minister's special advisors are allegedly feuding. Lots of people are leaking from campaign headquarters. Run by Linton Crosby.
Yeah, I mean, I think having worked with Linton in the past, the thing that he was absolutely right on was that he does not want a running commentary on the campaign in the press. And I think, unfortunately, what you're seeing today is it's not gone brilliantly, because there is quite a lot of running commentary on the campaign. And the thing is, if you're behind the scenes, if you're an aide or an advisor, you don't want to become the story. And what you can see is that a lot of the media are actually moving a lot of behind-the-scenes people to front and centre and asking questions about that. And I think that that is something that in any campaign you want to be very careful about. Actually, there are not many stories in the papers today of any campaign saying this is something positive we will do.
If you have as big a wobble as happened last Monday with that social care promise, it's very difficult to keep things together. And it seems quite clear that people are sort of staking out their position. I never supported it anyway. I'm going to brief that. That's in one way understandable, but incredibly unhelpful for a campaign that's supposed to be strong and stable.
And destructive, yeah.
All right, well, let's move to politics elsewhere. John, you've been following Trump tours, as we've been calling them. We've all enjoyed that picture of him moving the guy aside in Montenegro, that real alpha male moment.
The Montenegro manoeuvre, the best bit of it was not just the manoeuvre, but when he did it, he went with his jacket afterwards, as if to say, job done, I'm at the front of the line now.
We definitely need a bit more machismo in international politics.
So he's now arrived back in Washington. and he's had a holiday away from all the headlines that are crowding in.
Well, I was going to ask about that because I guess the sort of liberal fantasy from the moment he was elected is that he's going to be impeached. He won't last long. And it's just beginning to look a little bit less like a fantasy.
Yes, and I think there are problems mounting up. I mean, there's the story that's, I mean, this is from the New York Times. Trump returns to crisis over Kushner as White House tries to contain the issue. It's a very similar story in the Wall Street Journal. Jared Kushner considered setting up secret communications with Russia and this sort of supposed back channel. So everybody is lawyering up at the White House. The other big thing is this, the leak of the conversation that Donald Trump had with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, where he called Comey a nut job. That was kind of got a lot of the headlines. The really important bit was when he said, you know what, I had a lot of pressure on me, but now that I've got rid of my FBI director, that has gone. That leads to, are you obstructing justice? And that could lead to
impeachment. And we say this is not a rumour. This is probably a leaked minute.
Yes, it's not just a conversation that someone has recounted to the New York Times. It seems that that was the official minute of the meeting, saying that the president thought he was a nut job and that the pressure had been relieved and that by getting rid of him, things had got easier. If that's the case, you've got a special counsel now investigating the Russia links. It may be that there is no original Russia link, but the attempts to kind of cover things up and maybe fire the FBI director because of the job he was doing on Russia.
It's always the cover-up that gets
always the cover-up.
One of the great cliches.
Yeah.
And, of course, this does connect, sorry, I was going to say, this does connect to our election campaign and the terrible events here, doesn't it, Jackie Smith, because of all the leaks coming from outside, from the US. Which
I'm interested in whether or not, when he gets back to Washington, he's going to do anything about the leak of the information related to the investigation in Manchester, which looked pretty outrageous to me. And obviously the Greater Manchester Police were pretty angry about it.
I'd tell you what was fascinating. It happened when we were in Brussels on the kind of leg of the world tour. The White House staff came up to me and said, why are you making such a big... Why are the Brits making such a big fuss about this? And the journalists were... There's a very different culture in the US about revealing information. It seemed pretty commonplace what appeared in the New York Times.
Fascinating. I could sit here and talk about this all day, but sadly we've run out of time. Thank you all of you very much indeed. And this being the election campaign, we hear from a range of parties. In a moment, I'm going to be talking to the co-leader of the Greens, Caroline Lucas. But joining me now from Cardiff, Plaid Cymru's Leanne Wood. Leanne Wood, this all takes place in the aftermath of Manchester, of course, and Wales has not been immune from either jihadis or from victims of jihadi attacks. So can I ask you what Plaid Cymru's message to people who are thinking about how to vote and wondering about the security issue in particular? What is Plaid Cymru's message to them this morning?
Well, it makes no sense to us in Plaid Cymru for those public services that rose to the challenge and supported so many people in Manchester, the health service, the emergency services, the police, obviously, for those to be cut. And Manchester's police service has been cut and there are plans for more cuts. And it's absolutely awful what happened. It's difficult to see how you can absolutely prevent it in the future, but you can give people some more confidence by making sure there are plans in place and that emergency services are properly resourced to deal with things. We wouldn't need troops on the streets, perhaps, if there were enough police officers on the streets.
Well, that's a very good answer about the aftermath of the attack, but what about actually catching people first? Plaid Cymru MPs have voted again and again against surveillance suggestions in the House of Commons, against legislation on tighter surveillance. Aren't you basically on the wrong side of this argument?
We're against mass surveillance. We're in favour of more targeted surveillance. It makes sense that if people are under suspicion, that the police need to keep a close eye on them. And so we support resources for that. The idea of watching everyone and being able to access everyone's email and communications, that's where we have a problem, and that's where our MPs have voted consistently then against the Snoopers Charter, for example.
And this is absolutely the heart of the argument, because nobody really thinks, do they, the police are going to look at all of our emails, survey everybody. They've got 23,000 suspected jihadis in this country and they can't deal with them. So this fantasy that there's going to be mass surveillance of everybody, everybody is under threat, everybody's going to be watched by the big state if we allow these laws, it's ridiculous.
But if you're looking to keep people under surveillance, there's a very resource-intensive activity.
Exactly.
And the police need to be adequately resourced to do that. It's better that they watch those people who are at most risk and keep a close eye on those, rather than the entire population. There is such a thing as information overload,
yes,
and it's better to concentrate resources.
But they were never asking for being able to look at the entire population. They know who they need to look at, and they need the resources for that. Can I ask you very straightforwardly, after Manchester, a lot of people are thinking we need to think again about this whole issue of security. Are you in Plaid Cymru thinking again about it?
Well, you have to review security all the time. I mean, it's it's terrible that this has happened, but it's not. It's the most serious incident that's happened since 2005. So something is clearly working in some ways. But then, on the other hand, the person responsible for this was brought to the attention of authorities. There are serious questions that need to be answered as to why action wasn't taken earlier to prevent this. So we need to learn lessons from this. That's a cliche to say maybe, but you have to review at all times.
The army and some of the armed police are coming off the streets and the beaches and so forth quite soon. You've got a huge event in Cardiff, the Champions League, coming up next weekend. Do you want to see more armed police back for that? Are you concerned about that event in particular?
I want to see it adequately resourced security-wise, obviously. It's going to be a big event. Many people are going to come to Wales. I don't think people should be put off from coming. It's going to be an amazing event. And I'm sure by making sure that the security side is properly resourced, that people will have that confidence and assurance. Leanne Wood from a sun-kissed Cardiff, thanks for talking to us very much indeed. And so to Caroline Lucas. Again, the same sort of question. Are you thinking again in the Green Party about security issues after Manchester?
Well, I think we're always considering and reconsidering in the light of evidence as it comes forward. And certainly one of the concerns, I think, well, one of the concerns I was going to say was that apparently people were reporting concerns about Salman Abedi well before the Manchester atrocity. And so certainly one of the questions is, why weren't resources put into following that up at the time? So certainly there are questions that need to be answered. But I think certainly also it's clear that the blame for what happened in Manchester is solely with the perpetrator himself. It was an absolutely appalling atrocity. Absolutely. It happens in a context, and it's right for us to reconsider all aspects of that context, right through from levels of policing through to the kind of debate that the Labour Party and Jeremy started this week. And presumably the internet as well. I mean, you say in your manifesto that we think the internet should be free of state and corporate surveillance with our rights and freedoms protected. In these circumstances, and knowing that jihadi groups and extremist groups use encrypted messaging on the internet and also use the internet to promote their hate-filled messages, do you really think that's a sensible policy? Well, our policy is about opposing the mass industrial scale surveillance of emails. And let me explain what I mean by that, because there are plenty of people who you would see as being on the side of the argument that are absolutely wanting to make sure that we crack down on this as hard as possible, who would say that the bigger you make the haystack in which you're looking for the needle, the harder it is to find it. So having all of that extra surveillance doesn't work. It's targeted surveillance that really makes the difference. And that's what we're certainly in favour of. So it's very hard to understand. Are you saying that you don't want the police to have extra powers of surveillance, or you do want the police to have extra powers? We opposed the Snoopers Charter on the grounds that there was evidence that suggested that it wasn't going to be effective. So it wasn't on a kind of only a civil liberties line, although that's important. It was also about how effective is it if you're increasing the number of people you're putting under surveillance, if you're mass trawling. Because do you know what? You know, people like myself are on the domestic extremist list. People like peaceful environmentalists are on that list. How does that help if the police resources are being spent looking after people like myself or my colleague Jenny Jones, rather than people that really pose a serious risk? And that's what we're saying. Do you think that ending end-to-end encryption is wrong? Do I think that ending end-to-end encryption is wrong? No. So you would like to see this end-to-end encryption, very, very controversial. I'll be talking to the Home Secretary about it later on. You'd like to see that ended? I want to take advice from the security services about what they think needs to keep us safe. That is the bottom line for the Green Party. One thing we do know is that Abedi's friends and family contacted the state, did exactly what they were supposed to do through the PREVENT mechanism. But you have called PREVENT this
attempt to involve the community more, which in some respects has worked, xenophobic. Why was it xenophobic?
Because many in the Muslim community believe it's been an attack on their group in particular. We absolutely want there to be a mechanism whereby people can come to the state with concerns. But when it is perceived by the Muslim community itself as being a toxic Big Brother brand, then we need to look at it again. And that is what the Mayor of Manchester is saying. That is what many people, the Foreign Affairs Committee and others, have said. We need to review Prevent to make sure that it is seen as something that is broad and inclusive and absolutely bottom-up, not top-down through Big Brother.
Let me put it to you that this is knee-jerk liberalism, and one of the very few Muslim MPs in the last Parliament, Khalid Mahmood, said this. He said, by and large, the majority of the Muslim community have no real issue with Prevent. What we see is small groups of so-called activists who continue to condemn Prevent but provide no alternative.
Well,
and he's talking really about people like you.
Listen, my position on Prevent is guided by the Muslim community that I speak to in my own constituency and who I speak to elsewhere. It's about what is the most effective way of keeping people safe. And when you have a programme that has lost credibility in vast areas of the Muslim society, then I think it means we should look at it again. It doesn't mean scrapping it and not replacing it, but it does certainly mean making sure we have a mechanism that has the confidence of the communities so that we can make sure that we do our very best to keep people safe.
Right, Caroline Lucas, in other circumstances, we'd be talking about many other things, wind farms and solar energy and all the rest of it. On this,
and jobs and
jobs
climate
and
change.
all the rest of it. But today, this morning, you'll understand that's all we've got time for. But thank you very much indeed. And so to the weather. I don't normally think an awful lot about this bit, but since I learned that this week that there is an entire Twitter account devoted to me talking about the weather called So to the Weather, I feel completely paralysed, tongue-tied, brain frozen. I guess all that I can say is it's been very hot and sometimes very wet. But you do that anyway. Darren Bett is in the BBC Weather Studio. Darren.
Maybe I should start following you on Twitter then, Andrew. Now, today the weather's been fairly quiet so far. There'll be some spells of sunshine around today, but we are expecting some storms to return later from the south. And it's areas like this in Minehead in Somerset that will see the weather changing significantly later. But ahead of that, the cloud continuing to thin and break up. Most of us enjoying a fine day with some sunshine, but thickening cloud comes across the channel and these storms and heavy rain arrive mainly in the southwest, South Wales, 1 or 2 showers into the southeast later where highs of mid-20s. It's nowhere near as hot as it's been recently though in the north of Scotland. But some sunshine here. The storms though continue to push their way northwards this evening, developing more widely. We're getting more widespread heavy rain and storms across England and Wales overnight. Lighter rain for Northern Ireland, pushing into southern Scotland, northern Scotland. More comfortable night for sleeping. Much less comfortable, though, in the humidity in the south after those storms. And those storms rumble their way northwards through the Midlands into northern England tomorrow morning. Some rain making further inroads into Scotland, clearing away from Northern Ireland. And then to the south, a peep of sunshine, but some warm and muggy air in the southeast and 1 or 2 showers. But much, much cooler in Scotland here. Temperatures only 12 or 13 degrees in the rain. Andrew.
Well, I didn't sleep much last night. This is probably too apparent. Now, a lot of people who are only half paying attention to the election campaign more or less assumed it was in the bag for the Tories. But now the polls have been closing a bit, they're having to focus for the first time on the real possibility of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister. And that means almost certainly that Diana Abbott would take over the Home Office, and she joins me now. Diana Abbott, a lot of people watching this programme after Manchester thinking about who to vote for. Look at you and look at Jeremy Corbyn and think, do you know what? We don't completely trust you to be in charge of the security of this country, given what you have said in the past, some of the things you have done in the past. You can take a moment now to, as it were, talk to them and tell them why they're wrong about you.
Well, first of all, before we move on to the politics of it, I think it's too soon to forget the victims. 22 people dead, and also so many people, families and children, who have seen things which will haunt them for many years.
Quite right. We have talked a lot about the victims, but quite right.
I think it's important to say that. In terms of why people should vote Labour in the forthcoming general election, they should vote Labour because we've put forward a manifesto which will be a transforming manifesto, which is talking about investment in the NHS and education, and is also saying how we would fund it.
And I'm going to come on to that manifesto in some detail in a moment. But before we do, I just want to ask about your own record. And people looking at you and they say, I don't trust Diane Abbott to be in charge of the Home Office.
Well, first of all, I think there's something to be said for a Home Secretary who's actually worked in the Home Office. I worked in the Home Office for nearly 3 years as a graduate trainee, and I know how it works from the inside. I think there's something to be said for a Home Secretary who is a very young woman, worked and campaigned with diverse communities, and sees these issues not just from the point of view of bureaucrats, but from the point of view of diverse communities. And there's also something to be said for a Home Secretary who spent 30 years as a constituency MP and knows how these issues impact on ordinary people.
What about a Home Secretary who has in the past said that we should abolish MI5?
Well, I think you've got that from some...
Early day motion which you signed in 1989. I can read it back to you if you'd like me to. She said she called for the abolition of conspiratorial groups like MI5 and Special Branch, which are not accountable to the British people. Signed by Diane Abbott.
At that time, I and a lot of people felt that MI5 needed reforming. It has since been reformed. And of course, I would not call for its abolition now.
So you have, that Diane Abbott statement has gone, and you're pro-MI5. You're a supporter of MI5.
No, I'm saying that MI5 has gone. It's been reformed. It's a different MI5, and that's why so many of us are able to support it now.
And you fully support it because also in your career in the House of Commons, you voted again and again, around 30 times, against anti-terrorist legislation for different reasons.
What you have to remember is that on many of those occasions, I and Jeremy Corbyn were going through the lobby with Tory MPs. Theresa May herself voted against the 2005 Prevention of Terrorism Bill. She voted against ID cards, and she voted against control orders without sufficient legal intervention. And my point is this: nobody votes against these things without a lot of thought. And the view of myself and Jeremy and most of the members of the Conservative Party, including David Davis at the time, was this was counterproductive, counter-terror legislation. Some of the positions we voted for were upheld in the courts.
Let me come on to your bit. You say nobody votes against these kind of things without a lot of thought. Shortly before 9/11, you voted against prescribing Al-Qaeda as an organisation. That was a huge mistake on your part, was it not?
Have you actually read the legislation we were voting on?
I have read the legislation and I've looked at the addendums as well.
And
I've got here.
What the legislation brought forward was a whole list of organisations, some of which some people would argue were not terrorist organisations, but dissident organisations. And to say that because...
Which ones? Because I've got the list here. Al-Qaeda, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, the Armed Islamic Group, Harakat Mujahideen, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad Group, Islamic Army of Aden, the Abu Nidal organisation, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Which of these should not be prescribed?
The titles are one thing, but the reality of some of those groups, whether they were dissidents in their country of origin, and that's why some of us were not willing. Had they taken out Al-Qaeda as one thing, that would have been something. But, you know...
This is a group of really dangerous organisations from all around the world, many of whom have killed a lot of people. Lashkar-e-Taiba carried out the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which killed more than 170 people. That was on the list. This was, you know, no list is perfect, but it was a pretty good list, and you voted against prescribing those groups.
Because there were groups on that list which I deem to be dissidents rather than terror organisations. You have to give people credit for thinking about how they vote. As I said to you earlier, we're hearing about all this anti-terror legislation that Jeremy and I voted against, but we're not hearing that the Tories voted against some of the self-same legislation, particularly control orders and detention without trial.
Well, there is the list. Which of those organisations do you think should not have been prescribed? Because, you know, you voted against the whole lot being prescribed because presumably some of them you thought were OK. I'm just wondering which ones you think are OK.
It's not that I thought they were OK. I thought that they were dissident organisations.
You can have the list if you'd like it.
No, I don't need it, Andrew, because the point is, at this point, less than a week after those people died in Manchester, we should be talking about how we go forward to make this country safe.
But to know how to go forward, we have to look behind and look at people's records, which is why I've been talking about you. Now, Jeremy Corbyn got into some trouble with Andrew Neil in his interview where he said he had not met the IRA, and he was then photographed lots of people from the IRA during the course of his career. You yourself said that it would be a defeat for the British state would be a great liberation, a great move forward at that period of time. Do you regret your support for the IRA right back in the 80s?
That particular quote you're referring to comes from a now defunct left newspaper, and it had, as well as
But you said it, didn't you?
No, but what I'm saying to you is this. It was 34 years ago. I had a rather splendid afro at the time. I don't have the same hairstyle. And I don't have the same views. It is 34 years on. The hairstyle has gone and some of the views have gone.
So you no longer, you regret the fact of what you said then about the IRA?
The hairstyle has gone, the views have gone. We've all moved on in 34 years, haven't you, Andrew?
We've all moved on. I'm just wondering, do you regret what you said about the IRA at the height of the bombing?
What specifically do you want me to regret?
Well, I can read the quote for you and find it here. Basically, what you said was that a defeat of the IRA would be devastating for the British people, and it was a defeat for the British state was a good thing, you said, at the time when the IRA was attacking the British state. And you said that the reason for the violence was entirely caused by the British presence in Northern Ireland. I'm saying, do you think those statements now are wrong?
It was 34 years ago. I've moved on.
You've moved on. All right. I've got the quote here, finally. You said, the Ireland is our struggle. Every defeat of the British state is a victory for all of us. A defeat in Northern Ireland will be a defeat indeed, was the quote.
34 years ago, and I've moved on.
OK. And within a few weeks, you could be Home Secretary. And one of the things we know from Amber Rudd that she spends 2 hours a day signing orders approving the surveillance of individual people. Would you be prepared to sit there now and do that?
Of course, if the evidence was presented to me. Remember, I was a Home Office civil servant. I know how these things work. So if the files were put in front of me, evidence were put in front of me, of course I'll sign orders for surveillance. That's very much part of the job. OK,
let's turn to another big issue, I think, today, which is encrypted services on WhatsApp and other mobile messaging devices. Do you oppose or support forcing those companies to reveal what they're doing?
I think the problem with a lot of these companies, they're American companies, and they feel very strongly about the right to free speech and so on. But we do have to work with them to allow us to access some of these messages. There is an issue about end-to-end encryption. We have to work with them. And if they're not willing to cooperate, we do have to consider what further action we could take. But I would hope, given the tragedy in Manchester, that these companies would want to work with the British government.
OK. Let's turn to something else. Again, I'm afraid reported in today's papers, which is that as recently as 2010, you told a dinner party, we shouldn't put innocent people's DNA on the database, fair point, and we shouldn't even have guilty people on that database either. Again, as somebody who's going to be Home Secretary, do you still support that statement?
What you have to remember is I'm also a constituency MP, and I'd had to deal with some very difficult cases of children who'd not actually been convicted of anything, who had their DNA on the database, and I had a huge struggle to get their DNA taken off. So yes, we do need to be careful about taking children's DNA. Children who have not been convicted of a crime.
You didn't use the word children there.
Yes, because I don't know where that story comes from, but what was on my mind was a case I was dealing with at the time about a child whose DNA had been taken.
So it can be very, very clear. In terms of retaining a strong DNA national database, are you in favour of that or against it?
I'm in favour of a DNA database. I'm not in favour of keeping the DNA of children who've committed no crime.
Only children. So anybody else who's guilty of some crime or has been found guilty of that, their DNA should be kept. Do you agree with that?
Yes,
you do agree with that? OK, well, let's move on. One of your big announcements has been lots more officers, including another 1,000 people for the security services. Now, they are already increasing by 1,000 after David Cameron's government. Is this another 1,000 beyond that?
No, but that 1,000 hasn't been recruited. And what we're saying
They're doing it at the moment, they say.
They say, but they haven't recruited them yet. So we're saying that we want to recruit 10,000 extra police officers, community police officers, because we think community policing is key. We want to recruit 3,000 extra firefighters, 3,000 extra prison officers, 1,000, as you say, people in the security field and 500 more border guards, because we think protecting our border is so important.
So you know the next question. How much extra are you going to spend on MI5?
Altogether, well, on MI5 we're not spending extra because the government's put the money aside. Altogether...
So this is not really a new announcement at all?
No, well, it's part of our Community Safety Pledge card, and altogether, the things we're talking about, the 10,000 extra police officers, and remember, the reason that we've had to promise 10,000 extra police officers is that on Theresa May's watch, there are 20,000 police officers down. So the cost of the entire package, which is 10,000 extra police officers, 3,000 firefighters, 3,000 prison officers, 1,000 security people and 500 border guards, will be 417 million.
Got the number. Well done. Thank you very much indeed. Now, in the Labour Party manifesto, it says, freedom of movement will end when we leave the European Union. No ifs, no buts. Are you in support of that policy?
Freedom of movement obviously ends when we leave the EU. We only have freedom of movement as part and parcel of being in the EU.
And a Labour government will end it?
If we leave the European Union, freedom of movement ends. What we should be talking about is the immigration arrangements we have when freedom of movement ends. There's no question that it ends when we come out of the EU.
It's just that you have said ending free movement has become a synonym for anti-immigrant racism. Which suggests that the Labour Party manifesto has got lots of anti-immigrant racism in it.
No, I don't think you're reading the manifesto properly. Of course, I think that anti-immigrant rhetoric is toxic and actually very bad for business. We are seeing the numbers of EU migrants going down at a time when we are 24,000 nurses short. So anti-immigrant rhetoric is unpleasant, but also bad for the economy. But on freedom of movement ends when we come out of the EU.
If you win the election and you become Home Secretary, you will be the first black person in any one of the major 4 offices of state. It will be a huge change. Will you run the Home Office differently in terms of its attitude to racism, communities and so forth? Will we notice a step change having a black Home Secretary running the Home Office?
I will run the best Home Office that I can. I'll draw on my experience having worked there. I'll draw on my experience as an MP at the grassroots. But we will have the best Home Office that I can run, which will draw on some of the Home Office's best traditions. And above all, will keep this country safe.
Diane Abbott, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Now, coming up later this morning, Jo Coburn will have all the election campaign latest, and she's going to be talking to the Security Minister, Ben Wallace, and the Shadow Justice Secretary, Richard Burden. That's the Sunday Politics at 11 here on BBC One. I'm joined now by the current Home Secretary, the Conservative Amber Rudd. Amber Rudd, welcome. A lot of people watching this and remembering what has happened this week, we think after Manchester there has to be a step change, a completely different attitude to security in this country. Do you agree with them?
I believe that there's information we can gather and the steps we can take to improve this country's security. But be in no doubt, this is something that this country has been prepared for. The threat level has been at severe now since 2014, which is an attack is highly likely. We've invested in our intelligence services, we've invested in counter-terrorism, we've made sure that we put the tools in place. Actually, there'll be as many armed police by the end of this year as there have ever been. So we are stepping that up all the time. This hasn't come out of the blue, very sadly. This is something that we've been prepared for, we've been rehearsing for. And one other thing I would like to just say is that the reason why the handling of this terrible atrocity was done so well in Manchester by the emergency services, which I'd like to thank, and by everybody involved, by the people who volunteered, is because we had rehearsed for it.
Let's turn, if I may, before we get on to the main bit of the interview, to the latest, as it were. You've downgraded the threat level 1 point.
Yes.
And we hear that a large part of the group around this terrorist have been apprehended and taken. Does that mean that some of the group are still out there?
Potentially. I mean, it's an ongoing operation. There are 11 people in custody. The operation is still at full tilt in a way. And so until the operation is complete, we can't be entirely sure that it's closed.
Now, clearly, as you said, the security services do a great job and all the rest of it. Nonetheless, there are questions that must be asked. Can I ask you how many times the security services were tipped off about Salman Abedi before he attacked?
Well, it's not for me to be drawn in on what the intelligence services did or didn't know, particularly at this stage, Andrew.
Well, the trouble is we do know some stuff about this.
We do, but the fact is this is an ongoing operation. The fact that you've already asked me, are there other people that are going to be potentially pursued? That is because of the strong relationship between the intelligence services and the counter-terrorism policing. Of course, people will want to look afterwards to see whether there are signals that could have been learnt. How could we do this better? But can I also point out that since 2013, they have foiled 18 separate plots. They do a good job. We're not frightened, though, of learning lessons and improving.
I don't want in any way to diminish what they do. Nevertheless, what we do know is that Salman Abedi was identified as a dangerous man by friends and family, his community, doing exactly what we asked them to do. They phoned the terror hotline 5 years ago and then again last year. We know that the imam in his local mosque used the prevent strategy again to get in touch and say this guy is out of control, he's dangerous, and apparently nothing happened. Can I ask you directly, was Salman Abedi on a surveillance list?
I don't know those details that you've just said out to me because the intelligence services are still collecting information about him and about the people around him. But I wouldn't rush to conclusions, as you seem to be, that they've somehow missed something.
I'm simply saying that people had phoned the terror hotline as they're told to do.
As they should do, as they should do. And this, you know, the reason we've put in place the terror hotline, the reason we've put in place the prevent strategy is because we recognise the scale of the problem. What this reminds us, if we needed reminding, is the scale of the problem that we have. The enemy that we have, Daesh, that is trying to weaponise the young people in our society. We have put in place measures to make sure we can protect us, but we have been at severe, as I said, for a number of years, which is a threat, an attack is highly likely. But we will look to see what else we can do, which is why the Prime Minister has announced, actually in our manifesto before this event, that there would be a commission for extremism, to see what else we can do to root out extremism, to put legislation in place if we need to make sure we take action to stop extremism taking root in our society.
I guess the problem with the manifesto is that it now reads a bit like, inevitably, a pre-Manchester manifesto. You're going to have a commission, there's lots of perhapses and maybes and pushing things forward and talking and so forth. It doesn't necessarily have the urgency that a lot of people feel is necessary after the Manchester attack.
This government has always felt that urgency. That's why we've been putting additional money, additional resources. Okay. And that's why, also, I mean, it is significant that the Commission for Extremism that is in the manifesto was put in before Manchester. We know we need to do more. We recognise the scale of the threat, and that's one of the actions we're taking.
Across the country, how many serious potential jihadis are we worried about?
Well, the numbers have been confirmed by MI5 that they're looking at 500 different plots, 3,000 on a sort of top list, and then 20,000 underneath that. But that's all different layers, different tiers. You know, it might be just a question mark about one of them or something serious at the top of the top list.
I suppose what I'm wondering is the question about whether Abedi was red flagged or not at some point in the last few years may simply be because there are so many plots, so many people that they have to look at. One thing you could decide to do after Manchester is a step change in the size of MI5. You could double it. You could spend money that's being spent on Trident or something else and put it into this. Have you considered that?
We won't shy away from finding out what else we can do to keep people safe. I mean, the budget has already gone up significantly. We're recruiting 1,900 people for MI5. But, you know, we will look at this in a way to learn from it, to make sure that we keep people safe going forward. So if there is a need for more recruitment or more security or more armed vehicles, which we're investing in as well, we will look at doing that.
And if you win this general election and go back to the Home Office as Home Secretary, will it be business as usual with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor when it comes to budgets? Or are you going to say, look, we need to change this completely, we need a much, much bigger budget for this?
Well, can I just point out, from 2015 to 2020, we agreed to uplift the budget from 11 billion to 15 billion. But we will make sure that we put the right resources in to keep people safe, always.
OK, we were talking earlier on during the paper review about where Abedi had been, and we know that he's been to Libya. We think he may well have been to Syria. How many jihadis have come back from Syria to this country, do you think?
We don't know the exact number. What we do know is that in engaging with the intelligence services and with the police and with the border force, we make sure that they have the tools to track them and keep them out where we can.
Is it possible to tell where somebody has been when they come in? I mean, somebody comes through Heathrow, we don't know where they have been. They might have come in from Paris or Istanbul or wherever. How could we possibly know if they've been to Syria?
Well, it's all intelligence-led. And, you know, we have very good intelligence services who help to collect that information to make sure that we do follow and track the right people who might be dangerous.
Because the government has done one thing that could help you in this regard, which is to introduce temporary exclusion orders.
Yes.
How many of those have been used?
Well, I'm not going to give you the exact number, but I can say we have started to use them.
Because it was zero until very recently.
It is no longer zero. It is part of the toolkit that a Home Secretary has so that we can keep people safe.
Can I move on to some of the other things that people have speculated you might need to look at now as a result of that? You have an entire strategy in place for trying to pick people up and identify them, but you got rid of Labour's control orders. Under the Labour government, control orders were highly controversial. There were lots of civil liberties issues, but they seemed to be effective and they were often very well used. And they included curfews and they included electronic tagging. If Abedi had been subject to that, he would not have been able to commit the Manchester atrocity.
The security services and the police have the tools that they need. We don't have control orders, we have TPIMs. They're more robust in legislation and we use them effectively. We are in constant discussion with the intelligence services and with the police to make sure that we have the right tools that they need. They have the ability to come to us, come to me as Home Secretary, and for me to sign off TPIMs. We will do that where we need to.
So TPIMs, for people who don't understand what they are, they're terrorism prevention and investigation measures, and they can include a form of house arrest. You've used them only 6 or 7 times so far.
Well, slightly more than that, but again, I can't give you the exact number because it's a quarterly reporting method. But it's not for me to say how many TPIMs should be out there. It's for me to say to the intelligence services who will keep us safe, tell me how many you need, what the evidence is, and then we'll take them forward.
The reason I ask you about this, Home Secretary, is that Lord Carlisle, the former independent reviewer of terror legislation, said it was a grave mistake by the coalition government to remove control orders and to produce something which he called was more dilute.
Well, I think that quote may be out of date because Mr. Anderson, who was the reviewer as well, subsequently to him, has said that they represent the mature evolution following control orders. And Max Hill, just today, who's the reviewer for terrorist legislation, has told us that there is no more legislation needed currently. So we are constantly alert and we won't shy away from introducing new legislation when it's needed, but I think we have the tools in place at the moment.
The last time we talked, after another terrible terrorist attack in London, we had a discussion about end-to-end encryption.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of comment after about what was possible and was not possible.
Indeed.
Can I ask you directly to explain what your proposal is now?
We are making good progress with the companies who have put in place end-to-end encryption. Some of them are being more constructive than others, but we will continue to build on that. The area that I'm most concerned about is the internet companies who are continuing to publish the hate publications, the hate material that is contributing to radicalising people in this country. I also spoke about setting up an internet forum, which we did in the UK, and now the Prime Minister has announced just this week, coming back from the G7, that she's agreed to do an international forum. So we're continuing to build on better relationships with the internet, to ask them, as the experts, to make those changes so that people don't get radicalised and the terrorists don't have somewhere to hide.
OK, the problem with end-to-end encryption is that the technology to achieve that the software is out there, freely available all over the internet. You can make your own. And so if a terrorist is using WhatsApp, for instance, and you make WhatsApp give you a backdoor in, they just simply can move to another messaging service and then another and another and another. And eventually, if you close them all off from end-to-end encryption, then they can build their own. The only way that you could stop this is by banning end-to-end encryption completely.
Well, what we're doing is challenging the people who are developing and delivering end-to-end encryption to work with us so that we have a way of keeping people safe. Nobody wants terrorists to have a safe place to exchange information and to be able to plot their terrible atrocities. I believe we can get them to be more successful in working with us to find a way of getting some of that information.
But banning end-to-end encryption completely would destroy the internet as a place, as a marketplace, a place where people do their banking and purchase and stuff. It would totally devastate the internet economy in this country. So do you understand why people were so shocked when you appeared to suggest that's what you wanted to do?
But I never did suggest it. And what I have always said, because what I've always said is the internet provides an incredibly important place for people to do business. Encryption is important for banking, for everything else, as you say. But we need to do better to stop terrorists being able to use it.
In your interview today in the Mail on Sunday, you were asked whether or not electing a Labour government would result in more people being killed by terrorists, and you said yes. Do you really stand by that?
I would say look at the evidence. The evidence is that Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott and John McDonnell all have a history of not supporting terrorist legislation. Jeremy Corbyn has, in fact, in 2011 boasted that he opposed all counter-terrorism legislation. Andrew, it does worry
Diane
me.
Abbott gave quite a good account then of terrorist legislation which was counterproductive, badly thought through. In those cases, opposing it is the right thing to do.
No, I thought she gave a very poor account of not being able to engage with banning prescribed organisations such as the ones you suggest. We've banned them. We've banned a far-right group as well. I was the first Home Secretary to ban a far-right group, National Action. And what I would say to Diane Abbott is I've changed my hairstyle a few times in 34 years as well, but I have not changed my view about how we keep the British public safe.
All right, let's turn to one mainstream election issue, which was the embarrassing U-turn over social care. Damien Greenwood, who was sitting in that chair, I asked him directly, are you going to look again at this policy? He looked at me and he said, no. And then the next day you changed the policy radically. You produced a cap where there was going to be no cap. It has been an embarrassing U-turn. Is it not fooling the British people, taking them for fools, to pretend there hasn't been a U-turn?
No, I think that we've been very frank about it. I think we've levelled with people. The Conservative Party is a party that is very frank about these things, unlike the Labour Party.
Well,
yeah, no, I
really?
do think it is, yes.
Really?
I mean, we have put the most important element of that social care policy is that we're protecting £100,000 of people's assets, including their house. And we're making sure that they don't have to move from their house if they're using the equity from it while they're either at home using social care or elsewhere.
And you said as a government that there wouldn't be a cap. After the manifesto was launched, the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, went on the radio and said, we're getting rid of the cap. There will be no cap. So, is there going to be a cap?
So, well, the Prime Minister has said, yes, there will be a cap.
So that is a big
change. But we are not sure where the cap will be. What we are saying is we'll have a green paper to make sure that we set it at the right level and we consider all the other alternatives.
So it could be 200,000, it could be 300,000. All those people who were really worried about this policy when they heard it should still be worried until they know what the size of the cap is. Otherwise, they've got no protection.
I think that what people should realise is that we know that people are living longer. Over the next decade, there's going to be another 2 million people over 75, which is great news. But we have to be frank that this is going to cost money. We have to find a way that is fair for people to pay for it. This is the best route to do it.
Amber Rudd, for now, thank you very much indeed. Now look at what's coming up straight after this programme.
Join us at 10 from Peckham, where we'll be debating privatisation in the National Health Service. Is it a help or a hindrance? Then racism against white people. Is there such a thing? And last of all, did we evolve to become moral beings, or did we need religion to tame us? See you at 10 on BBC One.
All very interesting. Now, last Monday's attack reminded us all of the Manchester spirit. On the 1st of June at the Bridgewater Hall, a concert featuring all of the city's orchestras will be held in support of the victims and their loved ones. We leave you now with musicians from the Manchester Camerata and Happy Monday star Rowetta. Here they are with a Hacienda Club classic, You Got the Love.
Sometimes I feel like throwing my hands up in the air. I know I can count on you. Sometimes I feel like saying, Lord, I just don't care. You got the love I need to see me through. Sometimes it seems that the going it gets too rough, and things go wrong no matter what I do. Now and then I feel like life is just too much. You got the love I need to see me through. When food is gone, you are my daily meal. Ooh. When friends are gone, I know my Savior's love is real. Your love is real. You got the love. You got the love. That you got the love. Ooh, you got the love. You got the love. You got the love. Sometimes I feel like throwing my hands up in the air. I know I can count on you. Sometimes I feel like saying, Lord, I just don't care. You got the love I need to see me through. Oh, and it gets so rough sometimes. Oh,
is the private sector